Hi everyone. So welcome to this SSEESing Now event on the Belarusian elections. It's good to have you here. I'm going to pass over in a second to our chair, Tadeusz, but before that I just wanted to give a couple of housekeeping issues that if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat section, but they will be answered at the end. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end. So enjoy the seminar, and I'll pass you over to Tadeusz. Just to let you know, this is being recorded, so we will be able to share this afterwards.
Hey, thank you so much, Claudia. So yeah, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight as we'll be talking about what's going on in Belarus right now, and unprecedented, or at least an unprecedented in the last 10 years wave of political repression orchestrated by Lukashenko and his administration. First of all, there's been quite a number of discussions on similar topics in recent weeks, organized by various European and American think tanks and other institutions. So in order for our event to stand out a little bit, we decided to concentrate on one specific issue, one specific part of the problem. That is what the West can do in the current situation. Basically, there are different opinions at the moment. Some say economic sanctions should be imposed. Others say that economic sanctions are harmful for ordinary people. So it should be personal sanctions instead, or maybe some sort of Magnitsky Act, or maybe all sanctions are wrong altogether as they push Belarus towards Russia, and a different response is needed. So yeah, in order to figure out what could be the best Western response, we'll be joined tonight by three speakers: Kaciaryna, Šmacina, Andrew Wilson, and Stewart McDonald. Kaciaryna is a political analyst at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. She focuses on Belarusian foreign policy and regional security. She's also a fellow at the German Marshall Fund at the moment, I think, and there's many other capacities, but she'll be acting as indicated. Also, Andrew Wilson is a professor of Ukrainian studies at University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and also a senior policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations. And finally, Stewart McDonald is a Scottish National Party politician. He's a member of Parliament for the Glasgow South and a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, as well as the SNP's, Scottish National Party's, spokesperson for defence. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Kaciaryna, I'd probably like to begin with you. I think those few who follow Belarusian politics on a regular basis have been quite bored in recent years. There were obviously talks with Russia over integration, but in terms of internal affairs, there wasn't really much going on. Last year, parliamentary election was extremely hollow and boring. They were so boring that they didn't even cause any real reaction from the West, despite clear falsifications and everything. Basically, the political landscape in Belarus in the last 10 years has been getting increasingly sterile. Lots of active members of the civil society have emigrated. There were no popular political movements, no popular opposition leaders. I think it will be fair to say that the last 10 years in Belarus were in some sort of Brezhnev's era of stagnation. But now, all of a sudden, we have this, not one, but three popular opposition leaders, a mass mobilization of people. Viktor Babarika, one of Lukashenko's rival, has collected almost 500,000 signatures in his support, which is unprecedented by Belarusian standards. Another opposition leader, YouTube blogger Sergei Tikhanovsky, he attracted thousands of people to his rallies all across Belarus. Even in the most remote little towns, people gathered to listen to him. And it seems that Lukashenko and Belarusian authorities were actually lost at some point, and they found nothing better than to start a massive crackdown on the opposition and civil society. I think as of this week, some 700 people have been detained or arrested. 2 opposition leaders are in jail. The police are extremely brutal. There are reports of torture. Just today, the Central Election Commission announced that 2 most popular candidates, opposition candidates, were barred from running. And from what I see, people are once again taking to the streets right now, judging by reports from Belarusian Telegram channel. So, Katya, my question is, sorry for the long introduction, my question is, what on earth is happening in Belarus, and how come that Belarus has suddenly awakened, right?
Greetings, everyone. Happy to be here. And I guess I might sound a bit gloomy with my predictions and judgments. And I don't think that Belarus has been sort of in a sleepy mode before, because there were political candidates before and political activities. It's just they've been oppressed consistently throughout all the years of Lukashenko's presidency. And whenever there is a new wave of sort of political activity, then the government and the police and the special services would then apply pressure, disperse the crowd, oppress the opposition candidates and activists, and those vicious cycle would repeat every once in a while during the presidential elections, how it happened, let's say in 2006 or 2010. So I would argue whether this time is much different from what happened before, because we are observing the repressions against the front runners at the elections and the massive arrests and oppression against journalists and activists. What is interesting about this campaign is that we don't, among the front runners, we see not so much professional political leaders, those who have been for years active in the opposition, but sort of new faces who managed to appeal to broader audience, not only to the traditional opposition electorate, but to broader electoral base, to middle class, to people who have not always been interested in politics, or for those who have lost trust in the sort of professional oppositioners because they have been marginalized and acting in the same way for years. Today is an interesting day where the Central Electoral Commission announced the results, who were registered as candidates. The results are interesting, given that, let's say, the front runners were denied registration, and I mean Viktor Babaryka and Valery Tsepkalo, and also among the most interesting candidates, those who got registration, is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, but then again, she is running on behalf of her husband, who is currently facing criminal charges. And people who who express support for her, they essentially support her husband. But then again, Svetlana is facing much pressure from the authorities, and within previous month, she was threatened, particularly by social services, that her children may be taken away, and she's pretty much unsure, as everyone among the candidates, about their future and whether they would face any sort of brutal repressions, arrests, and so on. I would also point out that candidate Viktor Babaryka was declared by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience, given by the manner and how he was detained, he and his son, how they were detained and faced criminal charges on the ground of tax evasion, criminal, economic offenses and stuff like that. But the timing was very interesting in the midst of the campaign where he was campaigning for his candidacy. These repressions, they affected not only him, but some associates from the bank where he used to be, which he used to be head of, like Belgazprom Bank. And again, the scale of repressions touched not only him, but some of his closest circle. And the similar things, sort of predictable issues and obstacles were applied toward Valery Tsepkalo, who, first on the legal side, the electoral committee declared that he did not gain enough of the ballot signatures, and he tried to file an appeal, but it was not effective. And also there was a sort of defamation campaign launched against him, revealing some sort of issues about his economic activities in the past and some alleged information about his private life and stuff like that. Again, the timing is very interesting, and yeah. And then when we talk about the mass protests and the scale of well, again, pressure that the activists faced during previous month and right now, there were mass gatherings. Again, those gatherings and people like show up on the streets traditionally during every kind of political campaign in Belarus, just because it is easier to gather on the street during this period in Belarus. By this I mean that usually the rules of the public order are very much restrained, and people cannot just peacefully protest or gather on the street with any kind of demonstration, because they're very quickly dispersed by police. And whenever any kind of elections come up, the electoral legislation gives a little bit of sort of breath of fresh air for people to gather for any kind of reason and to channel their dissatisfaction with the status quo and with what the authorities are doing. And so people did gather on the streets in May when there were signatures gathered in support of candidates. And then when particularly Viktor Babarika was detained, people gathered again. And according to the estimates by human rights organizations, there were hundreds, in a few days in June, there were over 400 people detained. And this is not much different. The manner how those people were detained on the peaceful protest, the manner is not different from what's happening in the previous years, because people are usually detained by sort of some special services, by people who are not wearing any specific clothes indicated that those people are from the police. And then people are just dragged into the buses, brought into the detention centers, and then facing charges on sort of violating public order, swearing in public, and then they face fines and up to 15 days in administrative detention. And I would also point out that those who are detained, particularly including just people who were detained on the streets, and also political opposition leaders, they are facing ill treatment in the detention centers, and that's a huge issue for those people. And that's a great open question what we can do for them, or maybe if there would be, let's say, a statement from a official on that one, to support those people, would this bring any change or not. That's not my thought. Here I'm quoting Belarusian expert Sergei Navumchik about we can talk a lot about what the West can do in general, about the rhetoric and stuff like that, but then this particular maybe a move or a statement that would try to improve the conditions of those ill-treated political prisoners in the detention centers, this could be of help, and this could be of help right now for people who are there. And I would also briefly mention that not only people on the streets face those kind of repressions, but also journalists who are covering those events, who are live streaming from the streets, and also a number of bloggers who have some Telegram channels or other blogs who sort of articulate public opinion and who might be influencers. Some of them also face prosecution, and police would just break into their house and give them some criminal charges and stuff like that. So the situation is quite gloomy at the moment, and we don't know what would happen next in the next month when we are having the presidential elections. And when we look at the previous experience, when people were protesting on the streets on the day of the vote count, and there were incidents of violence, and again those vicious cycles of massive domestic repressions, which led to the distancing of Belarus from the West, and some sanctions, and this whole turmoil. And I would also I'm finishing my speech, but I will also point out that there were some statements by the EU officials, both in the EU delegation in Belarus and by EU officials, well, in the EU, such as Joseph Borrell, and there were hearings recently in the EU Parliament on Belarus, and they all point out that that's not like the situation is, they are closely monitoring the situation, and they point out that the violations on human rights, and they also point out the current violations or like inconsistencies of the electoral process with the OSCE standards. And just today we had quite an aggressive, well, sort of, or quite a strong statement by the speaker from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who, like the press secretary, who just again said that we don't want to hear those like external voices who would tell us what to do, and sort of like we're not afraid of the sanctions and stuff like that. So yeah, like I'm finishing here. I would be happy to jump in on the Q&A session, but I would also, I just want to underline that I'm kind of skeptical, or like I'm curious to hear what the West can actually do compared to what was done in the previous years in this vicious cycle of Belarus distancing and Belarus rapprochement with the West that was related to domestic sanctions, like domestic repressions, and then human rights violations. And then when the sanctions were eased, or when things were getting bad with Russia, between Belarus and Russia, and then Lukashenko turned to the West and then got better relations restored. So I would be happy to discuss what could be done differently this time.
Okay, thank you so much, Katya, for this interesting story about this unusual things like going down in Belarus. And I would like to ask Andrew, Professor Andrew Wilson, these protests and this unexpected emergence of not one, but three strong opposition leaders. Is it something to do with Lukashenko's mistakes, that maybe he became too self-confident after, well, 26 years in power now, right? Or is it something else in your view? What do you think?
Okay, thank you, Tadeusz. Hello, everyone. Is it Belarus's, is it Lukashenko's mistakes? Well, without getting too academic, if participants are interested, they can check out the website of belinstitute.com, where people have been talking about the legacy of Vitaly Silitsky, who died sadly young, 10 years ago, and who was the best kind of political analyst on Belarus for a long time. His key concept was preemptive authoritarianism. Why is the regime not preempting any threats to its survival as successfully this time? Well, one simple answer is that the regime has got a little less authoritarian over the last few years, and it's much more difficult to preempt or to close a gap that is opening and is quite wide. I think the government has actually seriously underestimated the changes that have taken place in the last few years, both psychological and physical, in terms of actual control of the streets and people being prepared to join these long public lines to sign in support of the various opposition candidates. So the government, yes, is long in the tooth and miscalculated in that respect. It also relied on some sort of informal techniques which have actually proven to be pretty unreliable. It was always up to the Central Election Commission, for example, about how the registration process worked and who was allowed to stand in the last instance. Obviously, they'd been told what to do in private, but that's been rather mismanaged in public. So you haven't had the kind of carefully managed formula that we've had in the past, where the number of candidates was relatively low and there was only one genuine opposition candidate. And as well as Lukashenko, there were fakes that outnumbered that opposition and whose job was really to criticize that opposition. We might be ending up in that scenario now where we only have fake candidates left, apart from possibly Tsikhanovskaya. So we will have to wait and see how the public reacts to that kind of obviously theatrical and farcical election. So the regime did miscalculate, but there were other things. One is the legacy of the protests back in 2017, when the government imposed an ill-judged so-called parasite tax, which harmed ordinary Belarusians. And there's a lot of talk of two Belaruses, kind of forgotten people, Lukashenko's supposed natural constituency. And coronavirus has kind of revived memories of that and has been a kind of metaphor for the authorities' neglect of ordinary people. And this blogger, Sikhanovsky, and now his wife, very much represented that constituency. But the slogan of the time, two Belaruses, is also relevant because two of the other candidates represent the other side of the equation, the new economy, the more private economy, the IT sector, which has been growing in recent years and in which the government has been rather reliant on for tax revenues. So the three candidates, two represented the kind of new economy, one the old economy. They've been knocked out the race, but so has the government, which in many ways, the old government, which supported in many ways that old, that growing new economy. So one very important consequence of all this is maybe Lukashenko's victory, but without really a program, particularly an economic strategy, and a pretty terrible economic mess, despite having tried not to lock down during coronavirus. Fourthly, of course, or finally, Russia's role. I won't say much because that's something really we've got to research properly. The government has sort of switched from accusing the opposition to being Western puppets to accusing them now of being Russian puppets. But we don't yet know really how Russia has interfered in the process, most of which I think is genuinely domestic. But of course, Russia is perfectly capable and prone to interfering in things that are domestic in origin. So what happens next? Well, you have an election which has been deprived of most of its interest, but unexpected things can still happen. You can have a kind of bandwagon effect, the kind of smart voting that Alexei Navalny has kind of promoted in Russia in the past few years, where there might not be a real opposition that you like, but vote for the kind of most oppositional parts of the kind of virtual fake spectrum. And we might see people sort of bandwagoning in that way, or we might see complete disinterest. And we should remember that Lukashenko has staged the election on August the 9th, in part planning for low turnout. A lot of people will be in their dachas. Coronavirus will still be a problem. Real turnout might be quite low, and so a faked high turnout might be quite controversial. So we could definitely get more protests and more coercion. What then happens? Well, there is a lot of talk of sanctions, which we had until 3 or 4 years ago. We have been, ironically, trying to think of a new Belarus policy in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, since those sanctions were lifted. But we haven't quite got there yet. I mean, the point was to try and build up our linkage and leverage with Belarus, which would have been a kind of long-term process. And therefore, to have more leverage, to slowly enmesh Belarus in the various diplomatic offers that the West has. But we haven't really been able to do that yet, which means that if we do impose sanctions, that they won't have the leverage that they otherwise would have. Belarus still trades preeminently with Russia, although the newer economy, the IT economy, trades more with the West, but they might be left to go hang in that kind of circumstance, which would be extremely damaging. Sanctions would, of course, work for our own purposes, which would be to signal our disapproval and to try and put some kind of limit on how far repression can go. But there may well be a severe downside. Russia will have much greater influence over a more isolated Belarus. And the whole basis of the kind of more mixed and more nuanced policy that we've had over the last few years, which has been to keep some emphasis on human rights, but to also support Belarusian sovereignty against Russian pressure, well, the second part of that will be clearly undermined. But that might be a price worth paying for being morally right, but we have to be clear that that's a price we may have to pay.
Thank you so much. It's actually, just to make a point, it's the first time I think these elections is, according to many voices that I hear, when the West actually has leverage over Belarus. That is the growing Belarusian IT sector, which mainly exports its services to the EU and the US, which amounts to some 10% of Belarusian GDP already. And I actually already heard voices that the West should consider it, but obviously it's a whole different question because it will be harmful for Belarusian citizens in the first place. But anyway, thank you so much, Stewart. There is actually over to you. As Katia mentioned, last week, the European Parliament had a discussion on the current situation in Belarus, and I actually wrote down one of the things. One of foreign policy advisors to the European Commission, she said the following: "What Lukashenko is doing right now is terrible, but insufficient to trigger Western action. But it's hard to see where exactly is the red line beyond which the nature of the internal European debate will change." It's actually an interesting quote because previously, when the first wave of Western sanctions was imposed in Belarus, I think it was 2004, the reason behind the sanctions was that Belarus simply rigged the election. The second wave of sanctions was imposed after 2010 presidential election, when on top of rigged elections, there were also a number of political prisoners. But now what we see is that all strong position candidates have already been barred from running. In the last 2 months, some 25 people were recognized as political prisoners. There is absolutely no doubt that these elections will be rigged as any others. But this time, apparently, it's not enough. So my question is, what is the red line beyond which the UK or the West in general will be ready to take some action? What do you think?
Well, it's good of you to give us an easy question, I suppose, is the first thing to say. Look, thanks, first of all, for inviting me to take part this evening, especially with two eminently qualified, far more qualified than I am, guests I'm here alongside with. So look, obviously, before we started the session this evening, we had a brief exchange about the fact that the UK has a new sanctions policy, its first independent sanctions policy. I think that for all I bemoan and deeply regret the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, that is a good thing. It has obviously come around rather speedily of late because of bad circumstances, you might say, in Hong Kong, deeply appalling circumstances in Hong Kong. But I think, to be fair to the UK government, which I'm not always minded to be, I think that Dominic Raab in particular can have a quiet moment of personal pride at the fact that we are in this position. But, and there is always a but, the proof will be in the political pudding, how far we go here. And, you know, obviously Hong Kong is a very unique set of circumstances because of breaches to the agreement, the Sino-British agreement. But we need to show the political will to act where we need to, and that has to include more actors than just the Chinese Communist Party. And the government has moved on some issues, for example, with relation to the Khashoggi murder in Saudi Arabia, and will also move against some individuals in Russia. I fear, as I had mentioned just before we got started, I fear that politically Belarus is not registering that high in UK political circles. You know, I'm sat here in my office in Westminster looking at the Foreign Office right now, and I'm not even sure who the official, not the minister, but who the official is in the Foreign Office, who I would go to talk to about Belarus. Sure, it's attached to somebody's job title, but everyone is so deeply engaged in the issue of Brexit at the moment. I think that, you know, the Foreign Affairs Committee obviously will have interest in how this new sanctions regime is going to work, and in particular, I'm interested in how it's going to work as far as Belarus is concerned. So on some of that, I think that yes, targeted personal sanctions make sense. I think where the UK government has been reluctant in some other cases in relation to Hong Kong, in relation to Syria, is to start removing UK citizenship from people connected to the governments of Hong Kong and the governments of Syria. I'm not entirely sure how many cases there are of people with UK citizenship connected to or a part of the government in Minsk. But I think that that's an area we need to start looking at, because citizenship does matter. It's for many people, it's the one, you know, obviously Belarus is not China, but the one thing a lot of rich Chinese individuals want are passports to the United Kingdom or passports to the United States. And I think we should be a lot more willing to be robust on saying no or revoking. I think the other thing that we can do, and again, we've seen this with the Hong Kong situation, is use our borders. We should be much more open to people in Belarus who are living under these types of circumstances. You know, you mentioned at the start of the discussion this evening, I think the figure you quoted was over 700 people arrested or detained at some point. I think that we should be much more willing. Unfortunately, this would go against the government's broader political ambitions, but I think we should be much more willing to offer the United Kingdom as a place of refuge to people who want to get away from regimes like the one in Belarus. I think also, you know, yes, it's vital that we don't cut off our nose to spite our face. I think we obviously do have to support democratic voices within Belarus and support citizens who want that, who are engaged in that. Sorry, I think I might have just cut out there. Because there always has to be a ladder off the route that the government is on. So, of course, as Andrew has just said, what we can't have are sanctions that just isolate Belarus to the point where it turns itself to being more reliant and being more at the behest of Russia. Nobody wants to see that. But at the end of the day, signaling our disapproval is an important thing to do. But, you know, like I suspect others who are here tonight, something might be morally right to do, but it doesn't always achieve the best outcome. I don't have the answers here. I realize that's part of my job as a politician, as a policy maker. But I think what we need to know from the UK government a bit more is what exactly it's going to use this new sanctions regime for. How willing is it going to be to step in? That's unclear at the minute. To me, it's something that Parliament will need to scrutinise a lot more. I think, though, if I can just finish with this, the single biggest thing we can do politically right now is draw attention to what's happening in Belarus to the political circles here in Whitehall. Because if it doesn't register in the Foreign Office in the way that it should, if it doesn't register in Parliament in the way that it should, then that's a problem. I mean, we have in the Parliament, in fact, I'm a member of the all-party parliamentary group on Belarus. These types of forums can be important, and we haven't even convened a meeting of that all-party parliamentary group. That's the group within the British Parliament, House of Lords, House of Commons, that takes a special interest in Belarus. We haven't even so much as had a convened a Zoom call to discuss what's happening in Belarus. So I'm trying to push colleagues to pay more attention to what's happening, to get on to government ministers about what's happening, because if we don't even achieve that, the whole discussion about what the United Kingdom or the broader West can do becomes rather mute, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, thank you so much for your opinion. I probably actually have another question to you, because on the one hand, the UK embassy in Belarus has condemned the arrests and violations of human rights and everything. But at the same time, last month, after the crackdown on the opposition and civil society has already begun, and IMF, EBRD, all other international financial institutions have postponed their negotiations with Belarus. Belarus simply went to the London Stock Exchange and issued more than $1 billion worth euro bonds to prop up its collapsing economy. And over 95% of these bonds were bought by the US, UK, and EU investors. And the London Stock Exchange even made a nice promo video about it. So do you think, do you think it's okay, because this money will be used to sustain Lukashenko's regime in the first place, right?
I mean, obviously, I don't think it's okay, but this I'm smiling because this doesn't surprise me. I mean, London. We could do a separate webinar discussion on London as a place for money to be laundered for all kinds of grisly governments, individuals, and causes all around the world. So no, I don't think it is okay. I think, again, if we're going to be serious, if the UK government is going to be serious about acting as a serious sanctioning actor on the world stage, then it needs to start in its own capital city. It needs to start with saying, with outlawing these kinds of actions, and you certainly don't stop at Belarus when you look for examples of how London is awash with these kinds of examples. And I'm sure Andrew and Kaciaryna and others on the call will have read or are planning to read Catherine Belton's excellent book, Putin's People, which cites many, many examples of this happening in a Russian context. What I will say on that, and this might sound slightly contradictory, and this goes back to my previous point about getting Belarus more to the forefront of the political agenda. I think so many in Whitehall and so many MPs in particular are guilty of being so obsessed with Russia. And don't get me wrong, I am very clear-eyed to the problems and threats that Russia presents, that I'm willing to bet if I was to take you to the MP's tea room right now and put to them what you've just told me, most MPs would be entirely unaware of the fact that the London Stock Exchange has been used recently in that way. So attention matters. Attention really, really matters.
Thank you so much. I think
just like to point out that Catherine is a former SSEES student of mine, and we wholeheartedly endorse her book.
Just as we get on to the Q&A, I would like to say that I can see people already putting questions in the Q&A box, which is great. If anyone would prefer to come on camera and ask the question directly, if you just put a note in the chat function, we will be able to organise that.
Thanks, Claudia. I think maybe just last one quick question to Andrew before we switch to the Q&A. Because Katia mentioned this vicious circle when first Lukashenko rigs the elections, arrests the opponents, then the West imposes sanctions, then Belarus begins reapproachment with the West, releases political prisoners, makes some very, very moderate reforms that don't change the core of the system. But then the West kind of believes or pretends to believe in Lukashenko's good intentions and lifts the sanctions until the next election cycle when it all repeats itself. Do you think there is a way to, because there is a very likely scenario it's going to happen this August as well. Do you think there is a way to break out of this vicious circle?
Well, it assumes that everything else is equal, nothing else is happening to disrupt that pattern. Because the pattern hasn't been completely circular. The last election in 2015, things were pretty quiet. A lot of people bought Lukashenko's sovereignty argument that now was not the time to rock the boat, but to back the regime in case Russia put as much pressure on them as they did on Ukraine. So a much more aggressive Russian policy might change the calculus. The economy is also a factor. We haven't discussed it particularly much so far, but basically it was good in the late 90s and the noughties. But Belarus has had a kind of on-off recession for the last 10 years almost, with mild recovery followed by further regular recession. So basically now in a period where the economy isn't self-sustaining and it needs these kind of hand-to-mouth measures like borrowing money on the London markets to sort of survive from in a very short-term calculus. And the regime is still in that position, so it takes big risks if it is to be as isolated as it was after 2010, for example, when the economy was stronger, but even then faced huge problems in 2011, sequential devaluation, big inflation, etc. And the government really doesn't have an economic program, having ditched the old government, which had one. Now it has a government to get through the elections and nothing else. So the government could repeat the cycle, if you like, but face much bigger problems than it did at any previous phases in the cycle.
Thank you. I think we just lost Stewart for some reason. So I think we'll...
Yes, I'm very sorry. Stewart has had to go off for a vote that's been called early in Parliament. So he says thank you for including him in the...
Yeah, thank you, Stewart. I think we've already received 6 questions. I think the first one will be to Katia, the earliest one. Katia, how is the Belarusian domestic propaganda machine reacting to the obvious violations of human rights by the government? And is it, that is Belarusian propaganda, official state propaganda, effective in changing public opinion, in your view?
I would say that the propaganda by the state, they have their traditional audience who follow their news and updates. Let's say like my grandparents would watch the Belarusian state TV without much, well, they would rather agree with the messages spread by those like TV channels. And there is a good portion of Belarusians who follow independent media and some Telegram channels with insights, like some insider information that is leaked by, let's say, government officials to those independent journalists and bloggers. So I would say like there is a split in the society who follows, who trusts whom, and this hasn't changed much, because recently there was sort of a video made about Babarika. It was spread on TV about his criminal charges and accusations and the crimes he's accused of, and the propaganda obviously tried to depreciate this candidate, candidate, and to show like how horrible person he is. But at the same time, there was a bunch of rebuttals in the independent media, and people like on Facebook would share the alternative facts and statements about this candidate.
Okay, thank you so much. We've actually already got something like 11 questions. So if in the Q&A section, you can actually upvote the ones that you like. So I think we'll be prioritizing the upvoted ones. I think the next one is probably originally was meant for Stewart, but now that he's gone, maybe Andrew, you'll be able to tell us what can increase interest in Belarus in the West, and why hasn't this quite worked before?
Well, bad news can increase interest and attention. In fact, although there isn't a huge amount of media interest in what's going on at the moment, there have been quite a few stories in relatively mainstream publications, much more than normal. Normally, the only stories about Belarus are either about Chernobyl or crazy sort of Orientalist stuff about what a weird country it is, carrying on playing football during coronavirus, etc. So sort of novelty stories. Maradona playing football or managing a football team in Belarus, that was quite big news. Whereas the kind of normal run-of-the-mill politics doesn't get the attention that it deserves, really, apart from at times like this. We're doing our best at SSEES, where Tadeusz is PhD. We may have enough English language literature on Belarus now to launch a module in Belarusian studies, politics, history, culture, etc. Either next year or maybe 2 years later. So that's a small thing that's happening at a university level. Culture always gets attention. Watch what the Belarus Free Theatre is doing. I've been talking to the people in charge of them. Obviously, they're a cultural institute, but they're trying to set up some kind of broader platform for talking about Belarus and Eastern Europe in general. Culture matters. I think, Tadeusz, you mentioned on your Twitter feed that there have been 2 really interesting novels recently, both set in the Second World War. The regime had given a green light to making films out of those novels. Unfortunately, that's one of the casualties of the protests. The kind of period of soft Belarusianization, the promotion of Belarusian culture, is over, at least at the official level, which is a shame because, of course, culture can be one of the things that gives more attention to a country. But culture is still happening.
Thank you so much. The next question is from David Dalton. Hello, Dave. He's asking, what's different now this time around in Belarusian society, in the state, in geopolitics, or in the economy, to think that the current protests will lead to any different outcome than previous protests or crisis? I don't know which one of you would like to take this one. Katia, maybe what's the fundamental difference this time that led to this enormous protests, which are enormous by the Russian standards?
First say that many things are similar to what we've seen before, and I'm somewhat skeptical when people say like, oh, maybe the social contract with the state is broken, or like the economy is doing worse now than it used to. And I would point out that there were massive like economic problems or some other like reasons for social discontent in the past. I would argue that we have new faces in the politics. Like before, among the front runners, among the favorites of the presidential campaign. Now, and those are people coming from business, like those are not associated with the sort of political opposition groups, for professional oppositioners who were campaigning or like criticizing Lukashenko for years with the same tools and techniques they've been using for years, and they kind of lost trust among the broader population. And this elections, we have new faces, the bloggers, and a few faces from the private sector, those who call for moderate, come with quite moderate agenda. They do not necessarily come with like radical slogans, but they talk about the necessity of reforms, structural reforms, and creating good conditions for the business. Thus, they kind of appeal to business and to middle class people. And what else is different is that Lukashenko, like that's my well, maybe not a speculation, but thought is that Lukashenko will have to leave at some point, one time or another, and probably this term would be his last one. and he would make some he would try to make some soft transition and to live on his terms, probably find someone to replace him, or anyways, like he will try to secure his exit from politics and make like an elegant goodbye on his terms. But this would also mean a few more years of stagnation, and we don't know much what would happen, who would come next, whether this could be some like pro-Russian candidates or some people from the elites. And I would also think that people who jumped in, the new faces who jumped into the campaign, they might have thought that, okay, even if we do not, right now we're playing in the unfair game with a predictable end, but like with the unfair vote count and being denied registration and all that. But this campaign is a good way to build political profile. This could be used for the future.
Thank you so much. Actually, one of the questions is precisely about what do you think will happen to the Lukashenko regime in the next 5 to 10 years? Is Belarus to follow the Kazakhstan scenario, or rather what Kazakhstan initially tried to do, that is increasing parliamentary power? Andrew, would you like to take this one? Predictions?
I'll try and link it to David's question. I mean, this is a very different election, but you asked specifically about whether the outcome will be the same. I mean, the regime could declare the same outcome, another 80% victory, but it'd be much more obviously false and much uglier. So the outcome of that outcome, what the consequences of declaring the same kind of majority as normal would be, I think is a bit more unpredictable. The regime has plenty of coercive capacity, like which it showed in 2010, 2006 elections. So it could possibly manage, albeit brutally, the kind of short-term fallout. But then the next few years, assuming Lukashenko survives a full term, would be very different after such a hollow victory. Is that a good time to embark on this kind of scenario of constitutional reform? Possibly not. That would disrupt the institutional setup where the presidency sits atop all the Siloviki forces and is therefore relatively secure. Would Lukashenko like a quiet retirement? Probably not. There are issues going back to the disappearances in the late 90s, year 2000, 2001, where he is certainly in legal jeopardy. Normal legal jeopardy of sort of corruption or whatever, but that specifically, I think, might make him think twice about ever retiring. But of course, people get old. I think the plan of a kind of soft transition that they had before they lost control of these elections may actually be now redundant. So they may have to think of a different one. So not the Kazakh scenario now.
I see. Thank you for that. We still have 10 more questions, some of them extremely interesting. So if you don't mind, I'm now talking to the panelists, try to be as brief as possible. So we'll manage to answer at least some of them. The next most upvoted question is about comparisons with the events in Ukraine back in 2014. What do you think about this comparison? Could it be an accurate prediction of what to expect this August in Belarus? So are we likely to see some sort of Ukrainian Maidan in Belarus? I think lots of people in the West ask themselves about. I don't know, Andrew, since you're unmuted.
Well, there are lots of differences. One is that there isn't the same prehistory. Obviously, before the Maidan, as we now call it, in 2013-14, you had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2004, and a series of other smaller protests. Belarus doesn't have that tradition. Belarus doesn't really have a West. It doesn't have a Galicia. It doesn't have a stronghold of history and protest potential. It has Minsk, but Ukraine has Kiev. You don't have equivalent of West Ukraine, but you don't have the equivalent of the Donbass as the kind of counterpole to that in Belarus either. I don't think the literal meaning of Maidan, which means square, the occupation of public space, is the way things that would pan out in Belarus. The regime is much more coercive, and it would be much more likely to stop that instantly. So if you are to have a Belarusian Maidan, you know, there's much more stress on Belarusian than there is on Maidan. That it would have to have different tactics, although it might have many of the same elements: social media mobilization, etc. We've seen a bit of that already. We've seen the big sort of shows of support for signature signing, and then these rather marvelously socially distanced sort of solidarity chains in support of some of the excluded candidates. I think that's the direction that things may go in, and therefore by definition we don't know what those tactics, what those scenarios might be. I don't think you could directly import the Ukrainian scenario at all. No.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much. Next question to Katia. Do you think Belarus has intra-elite competition like in Russia? And if so, how is it affecting the elections? Tricky one.
Yeah, I would say for that you really need to have good insights into the inter-elite competition, and otherwise this would be a speculation. I would assume that at the moment that there is sort of a unspoken agreement for the elites that Lukashenko is running for the next term. And then the good question is how they would well, try to compete for power for what comes in the future, when he would try to leave his position and to like who would come next. And then the most interesting events would unroll with again intra-elite competition and with Russian interest to meddle in those processes. So this is yet to come in the future.
Thanks. Next question. Do you think that Lukashenko blaming Russia for the protest was a tactical mistake? What do you think, Andrew?
Why a tactical mistake? Well, it might be a mistake if it's implausible. I think if we talk about specific candidates, then accusing either Babariko or Tsepkalo of being Russian puppets, I don't think was ever particularly plausible. In fact, in different ways, they're arguably to the right of Lukashenko, if that's the right way of putting it, in terms of attitude to the Belarusian language, support for Belarusian culture, etc. So none of them have really behaved as Russian puppets in the way that someone like Viktor Medvedchuk or Yuri Boyko is doing in Ukraine at the moment. They certainly haven't been following the script, obviously written in Russia. So implausible, I'm not sure if that's the same thing as a mistake. Well, it might also be considered a mistake in terms of Russia's reaction. But I don't think Lukashenko is at the stage where he's desperate for Russian bailout, which he wouldn't otherwise get, and that might be imperiled by the way that he's talked about opposition candidates. I don't think that really adds up. I don't know if that answers the question, but implausible perhaps is a good word rather than mistaken.
Okay, thank you. The next question is slightly different, and it goes to Katia. Katia, as a Belarusian, let's imagine for a second that the vote is actually fair and all of the original candidates are registered. Who do you think would be the best president for modern Belarus, in your opinion?
Like this would be my personal.
You have got a vote.
Well, I would say like either one from among the front runners of the actual like presidential campaign, those who like Babaryka, Tsipkala, Tikhanovsky, those people are passionate about and like qualified. Well, at least like two of them are, let's say, qualified enough, and then one is passionate enough to be the president of Belarus. And then there is another question: we actually don't need president to be almighty and to have all the powers concentrated in his hands. Like assuming that this person would then leave after his presidential term, and there will be a decent checks and balances system in place, then either one from those would be good.
Okay, thank you. Paul Fisher, I think you typed this question 2 times, so I think it's our responsibility to ask you. Paul is asking, is the opposition movement in Belarus receptive to Euro-Atlantic political support to the same degree as Ukraine has been since 2004? I would be interested in hearing the extent to which such active engagement is seen domestically as either potentially productive or counterproductive. I don't know, Katya, maybe you as an insider once again can tell us something about.
Sure. I'm not sure I got the question correctly, and it's popping somewhere in my. Could you like so? Are we talking about like opposition being open to sort of like pro-European?
What is the scale basically of Western support, political support, the Russian opposition receives, and how is it seen domestically? Whether people like it,
okay.
The population in general, or see it as a treason, maybe.
So yeah, like the Belarusian opposition receives and depends heavily on those money received from the West, like if you put it that way. But another thing is that it is nearly impossible to get those money for the opposition functioning, or even for some NGOs who have some political agenda or human rights agenda, to receive funding from inside Belarus. Because, well, the government restricts those. And yes, it does have an impact on how ordinary people trust those or do not trust those organizations, because they think, okay, like those are manipulated from the West. But there is another question, like how, like what are other ways you can get financing and to find another way to be like to function in Belarus in those repressed conditions.
Okay, thank you. Probably the next one, Andrew, for you. If the West encourages Belarus to turn away from Russia, for instance, by diversifying its oil supply and becoming more westward facing, could it encourage democratic norms, socialization, transfer into Belarus? For example, could strengthening the links of domestic civil society groups in Belarus with international civil societies encourage democratic transfer strengthening? Thank you.
Well, that's the strategy we've been trying to develop in the last 4 or 5 years, though I wouldn't call it westward facing. What we've been trying to do is encourage Belarusian sovereignty, a more diversified foreign policy, links to the West that enable it to be less dependent on Russia and less vulnerable to Russian pressure. Westward facing implies just looking in one direction. Oil. You have this US scheme to reverse supply Belarus via Poland. Geography gets in the way. Belarus has the, until now, historical good fortune of being, of having been a state of considerable investment in the late Soviet era, pipelines that go from Russia to oil refineries in Belarus and therefore on to the West. That's been a huge subsidy to the Belarusian economy under Lukashenko. Russia has cut the subsidies for that and the ability to make profit That's one reason for economic trouble in recent years. So it makes perfect sense for, in some ways, for Belarus to seek alternative supplies of oil, but then geography gets in the way. If it has to come further, then there's less profit margin available. So what we see is basically experimental, and I think as much political as an economic gesture to show that it can be done, rather than that it's an option for Belarus to completely reverse things overnight and get 100% of its crude from the West. So it's an interesting, until the present political crisis, what was an important part of this diversification strategy, and an important signal to Russia that Belarus did have other options. They might lose those options if it becomes more isolated after this current crisis, as we've been saying all along. So the oil move is interesting, notable, but we shouldn't exaggerate we shouldn't ignore the realities of geography.
I see, thank you. Katya, what do you think of the refusal by the authorities to issue a formal invite to international election observation groups to observe the election? This would be in contravention of Belarus' commitments of membership to bodies such as OSCE.
Well, from what I followed in the news, including the statements by the MFA press secretary today, there is not much clarity on whether some of the international observers would be invited at all. And from what I followed, the OSCE, ODHR participation is still in question. It's sort of pending. But I would also add that, well, yes, every year, every time we have elections, those OSCE observers point out the scope of violations, and at the same end, the Belarusian authorities happily ignore those. And on the contrast, let's say the Russian observers and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization observers come to Belarus, which they won't do this year, but they usually say that everything was in place and according to democratic standards. And also, I worked with OSCE observers last year at the parliamentary elections and visited a number of polling stations. And I would say, in reality, of course, their participation is the international missions presence is important for the electoral process, and to make sure that the presence of foreigners helps to ensure that the violations, or maybe there would be less repressions against people on the voting day and stuff like that. But their capacities are in fact quite limited, and even when people would try to speak directly to the observer at the polling station, they do not have much capacity and mandate to talk to them and to maybe record a specific violation. They would just gather some general impressions and then file them to the central body.
Oh, thank you so much. Andrew, another question to you. I think we're slowly coming to the end. From John Blackwood. With the election out of the way, if a weekend Lukashenko hangs on, what prospect for a speedy resolution of the Union Treaty with Russia, or will Lukashenko continue to drag things out? What do you think?
Well, the demand that Russia put on the table a year and a half ago now is for a so-called economic confederation, a kind of refinement of the Union Treaty, a common currency, common tariff regime, etc. I don't think anything has changed to make Belarus enthusiastic about that prospect. It would severely undermine economic and political sovereignty. It's not much. There are not many carrots in there for Belarus. Belarus doesn't like how the Eurasian Economic Union more generally is working. Certainly not working in their interests in the way that they'd hope. So other things being equal, Lukashenko would still try and drag things out because the proposal, the so-called Medvedev proposal made a year and a half ago, is not really in Belarus's economic interest. Whether he is able to resist pressure if the elections end in fraud, coercion, and Belarusian isolation? That's another question.
Thank you. Katya, I think it's going to be one last question for you. Would it be justified to say Lukashenko is following the example of electorate control occurring in Russia? I'm not sure exactly what is meant by Russian electoral control, but maybe you know better.
I would say, like, I would talk about the scale of like repressions and control over the society in Belarus and Russia, and I would say like it's the other way around, because from like my observations, Russian civil society has enjoyed more freedoms over years, long before and they have faced repressions and restrictions a little bit later than the Belarusians did. And from my experience, like from the observations, let's say in 2011, 2012, when we as Belarusians looked how Navalny is walking around Moscow with the crowd, or enjoying the right to protest, or how like we could like I could have observed in the Russian universities, there were actual opportunities to criticize the government or criticize Putin on the academia, and I was very much surprised, because in Belarus, in the Belarusian university, you were like, there's no way you could have said that out loud. And then things have changed in Russia steadily, but very obviously, when Putin consolidated power over past few years, especially after Ukraine, things got tougher in Russia, and I've heard a bunch of impressions from Belarusian civil activists and political activists that, like, oh, those naive Russians, they do not know how bad things could get, and we already know, we've already experienced that. Hope I don't want to change, like I don't want to finish on the very dramatic note, though.
I might add one thing. Occurring in Russia, a verb in the present continuous tense implies right now. So if you mean the recent constitutional referendum, then there are problems if you declare, what was it, 78% yes on a 68% turnout, as in the Russian case. This is meant to demonstrate your strength and how popular Putin still is, but when it's so implausible, it can have bad consequences in the longer run. So I think that might be, again, the scenario that Lukashenko might well be facing, of a pretty hollow victory, which doesn't really solve all the kind of underlying political problems which might then overwhelm him in the next term.
Okay, thanks. Probably one last question to both of you. I think the first one was initially meant to be for Stewart. It's about, it says, Belarusians all over the world want the world to know about political repression of the Belarusian people. NGOs in Belarus are working on sanctions to be imposed on Lukashenko and his family. And how could the UK Parliament help in this respect? And the other question kind of resonates, that one. Why should we in the West even care about Belarus? Is there anything that makes this country special, interesting for us? I think it's going to be the last one, and maybe Katya and Andrew, you can take on it. Katya, you first.
Yeah. So I would first say that, unfortunately, Belarus, there is no compelling reason for the West to care enough about Belarus. And it hurts me to say about my home country, but, well, we do not have much political weight or some geopolitical interest for our neighbors and for the West. So therefore, yeah, not much interest, not much political will there to influence situation in Belarus and to cooperate with Belarus. And I'm not an MP in the UK to talk about sanctions, but what I saw, an important point in this question was about the interest of the Belarusians all over the world to what is happening in Belarus. And that's interesting and quite unusual, like a new trend probably we're observing. When Belarusian diaspora, Belarusians living all over the world, they gather in their cities with Belarusian flags and gather trying to bring more attention to what has happened in Belarus. And they also come up with slogans like, do not be afraid, we are supporting you. But this also raises a lot of, well, skeptical thoughts from Belarusians inside the country, because they say, like, okay, you're feeling happy and safe in the US, like you can, I don't know, like enjoy your life and freedoms. And it does not, those words do not support a Belarusian who is being grabbed by police and dragged into the police bus. But what I see, like, and there is a sufficient split among the Belarusian activists on that, like how much help those Belarusians abroad could bring, even though they do crowdfund money to pay the fines for those detained on the streets. But on the positive side, what I see, the good thing is coming out of this process is that many people who even left the country, they demonstrate that they did not cut ties with their country completely, and many are not indifferent to the situation inside the country, and that's even those gatherings are a good way for people in diaspora to get together, and also some of them allegedly, I mean, I would assume that at some point when Belarus becomes more open and democratic, and there would be more opportunities for those abroad to come back and possibly build a better country together, as idealistic as it sounds.
Thank you so much, Katia. Andrew, why should the West care?
Well, the other question about the British Parliament, hopefully there's scope for action with assuming sufficient attention and interest from a broader coalition of MPs. Why should the West care? Well, negatively, the consequences of not taking the sovereignty of post-Soviet states seriously has been immense. If Russia is allowed to beat up on another country, we could be in another cycle of crisis. And remember how bad the crisis that began in 2014 has been. Sanctions, airline is shot out of the air, Russia undermining Western states, billions wiped off the Russian economy, not to mention a hot war in East Ukraine and the physical annexation of Crimea, which isn't a done deal by any means, which is short of water, one big problem. So the negatives are huge if we don't manage this correctly, but the positives are there as well. I mean, the birth of a new country is always cool, and that's what's happening right now. That to varying degrees, Belarus was more or less committed to something called the East Slavic idea. It saw itself as a fraternal nation to Russia. That kind of triangle, Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, is breaking down. And that used to be the basis for the Russian national idea itself. So that's something that's epochal. Changing nature of nation and identity in 3 countries in Eastern Europe, I think, is something that will be in the history books. This is a big turning point. And in Belarus, didn't turn particularly in 1991. It's turning more now, although Lukashenko might be trying to turn the clock back.
Okay, that was the last one. I think that would be it. I'd just like to thank our wonderful speakers for finding time in their busy schedule to join us tonight. Thank you, Katia. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Stewart, even though you're no longer with us. Thank you, Claudia, for putting all this whole thing together. Thank you, our audience, for listening and asking some really, really interesting questions. I just hope it was a fruitful discussion, that we all learned something new today, and that the knowledge we acquired will help us to better understand the situation in Belarus and make wise decisions. Thanks again, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tadeusz. Thank you, Claudia.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to Tadeusz.
Can we stay on the line a little?